Alright guys, this is the Period 2 study guide for APUSH, Econoland 2014. Bear with me guys, this one's going to take a little bit longer than Period 1, but I'll try to get you through as soon as I can. So this period is going to deal with colonization, and in particular, what are the differences between Spanish colonization, English, and French colonization. And we pick up with that with Key Concept 2.1, which says, differences in imperial goals, cultures, and the North American environments that different empires confronted led Europeans to develop diverse patterns of colonization. So as we go through this key concept, we'll be looking at those differences and how they set up shop, if you want to put it like that, once they begin to come over here. The first question under Key Concept 2.1 is how were Spanish, French, and British methods of colonization different? And I would encourage you, actually ask you to look at the colonization chart you did over the summer to get all the information that you need when it comes to this topic. But what I've done here is just kind of highlight some of the things that made these guys different. And the first place we'll look at is Spanish, Spanish colonization, and the two factors that made it unique were the aspect of tight control that they had over their colonies. We talked about how they were pretty restrictive and pretty hard on natives when they came over, and also the conversion aspect of it when it comes to religion and the fact that they were trying to convert the natives over to Christianity. So for whatever reason, like on the last one in Period 1, and I promise I'll get all this straightened out before Period 3, but the slides didn't convert over fully. So kind of go along with a sheet on this for under 1B, what were the characteristics of French and Dutch colonization? The answers to that question are number one, it was more economic in nature, and that all centers around the fur trade and other things like that. And number two, there were a lot more trade alliances with natives and also intermarriage with the natives as compared to the Spanish and the English. For slide 5, which is what were the characteristics of British colonization. Hey, looky there, we've got a blank slide on this, and once again, I promise I'll get this figured out at some point, but what you need to put under C, as far as the British colonies go, is that the colonies were first of all based on agriculture and in particular tobacco. Number two, there were large numbers of men and women, particularly with the northern colonies that came to stay as compared to the French and the Spanish. And number three, they were characterized by a lot more hostile relations with the natives. So make sure you get those three things down, even though they're not here on the presentation. Moving on to number 2 under Key Concept 2.1, getting a little more specific about the previous topic here. How did the economic, demographic, and geographic characteristics of the British colonies contribute to the development of the British American system of slavery? In other words, how did the demographics and the way the society was set up in British colonies lead to slavery? And the first answer to that is that English colonies attracted both males and females who rarely intermarried with natives or Africans. And you need to make key note of the fact that that is a demographic factor. And as far as the questions go, so how was this different from other colonies? Well, as we've looked at in previous ones in Period 1, with Spanish colonies in particular, there was a lot of intermixing in Spanish colonies that led to that social hierarchy with the mestizos and the mulattoes and all that kind of stuff. Well, in the British colonies, it was a little bit different because these guys, when they came over, had an available supply of women they could marry, and women to males as well. So there wasn't as much intermarriage, and what ends up happening was a rigid racial hierarchy where you didn't have, I don't know, I guess you could call it that acceptance, if you want to put it that way, that other colonies had. The second factor that led to the arrival of slavery was an abundance of land, which is a geographic factor, a shortage of indentured servants, which is an economic factor, and the growing demand for colonial goods, which is economic as well, led to the Atlantic slave trade. So the first question under that, where was most of this land located? Well, it's in the Chesapeake colonies, which we talked about being Virginia and Maryland, in the fact that they had a lot of agricultural potential for agricultural land. And then as far as what event contributed to a reluctance to use indentured servants, you also need to know the characteristics of indentured servitude that we went over in class. It's Bacon's Rebellion, and we looked at that for a full day. And how, there were some grievances that indentured servants had, led by Nathaniel Bacon, against the colony of Virginia with Governor Berkeley, and the conflict and the results that came out of that. And what it all comes down to is that indentured servants were getting a little sketchy. They were not trustworthy, and they were afraid they were going to rise against, so they needed a more docile or controllable workforce. And that's when Virginia plantation owners began to look towards Africa for their labor supply. So I'm going to take a brief second here and go through some of the characteristics and the origins of colonial slavery. I know under C it has know the characteristics. You need to know the characteristics as well as where it comes from. And it all gets going in 1698 with the Royal Africa Company loses a monopoly on a slave trade, which means it gets opened up to competition. And the one way to put it would be capitalism takes over. People are now able to go down and become involved in the slave trade, whereas they weren't able to before because of this monopoly. So what that means is that you have more people getting into the slave trade, which is inevitably going to lead to an increase in the amount, number, and everything of slaves that come over to the Americas, be it the Caribbean, be it what we now know as the United States. You need to be aware of where the slaves came from, and a majority of them came from Western Africa, particularly the modern countries of Senegal and Angola, and they were mostly war captives from inland tribes. So it wasn't like Europeans were going into Africa and capturing slaves, because they couldn't do this because they would pretty much die of disease as soon as they did, malaria and things like that. So they had to rely on other Africans to get them to acquire them slaves in the form of war captives and other things. Very briefly, just a map showing where a majority of these slaves came from, and like I said, it's Western Africa, particularly right in here, in what was known as the Slave Coast. And you can kind of take a look at this and try to figure out some trends and pay attention to the number of slaves that came over from each place. As far as the trip over from Africa to the New World, to the Americas, was incredibly brutal. You looked at that document from Equiano to get an idea of how bad it was for slaves that came over. The cramped spaces, the lack of food, the disease that ran through, the amount of people that died on the way. I mean, as far as, that went, 20% of slaves who left Africa did not make it to the New World. So be aware of the characteristics of it and how harsh and how brutal it was. Once again, just a couple of pictures kind of exemplifying how cramped, how horrible the conditions during the Middle Passage were. You can see how these guys are crammed in and how they were laid out. Be aware of that as kind of the overall tone of how this trip worked. Very briefly, just a map of the Middle Passage and how the trip worked. If you see it on a map or anything, be able to identify where the Middle Passage was located. So as far as what happened to Africans when they came over to America, one of the key things you got to remember, guys, is that the form of slavery in America was a little bit different than in other places in the fact that it was chattel slavery, which means slaves were treated as property. And because of that, when these guys came over and they were put up on the auction block, there was no consideration or anything for the family structure of the Africans who came over. So you would see mothers separated from their children, fathers separated from their wives, whatever it was. And it was not even consideration for these slave owners, because it was a strictly financial arrangement and business transaction for them, where they took no consideration for anything dealing with families or the feelings of the slaves or anything like that. Now, the thing that gave slave owners a justification for busting up families and treating slaves the way they did were the establishment of slave codes. And the first thing you need to take note of is called the Barbados Slave Code. And eventually you see these make their way into all the southern colonies. But all it means when you see slave code is that they're legal measures that tie slaves to white owners as property. In other words, they're not seen as people. They're seen strictly as a possession and as an asset in their business. We looked at this in class pretty well, but you need to be aware of the ways in which Africans both overtly and covertly resisted slavery, and there is a difference between those two words. Overtly, when you think about that, the first thing that needs to hit your head is rebellion or uprisings or things like that. And the most stark example of that is the Stone Oak Rebellion. We worked on it in class. You did the short answer. Ends up with a slave uprising where upwards of 100 white slave owners and whites in general were killed, and know the characteristics of it. As far as the result of it, white slave owners began to clamp down on Africans at this time. Not that they had an incredible amount of freedom before, but it became less after the Stone Oak Rebellion. Some of the restrictions, number one, they were not allowed to assemble anymore. In other words, they couldn't group up somewhere in town or on the plantation or whatever it is, and they were not allowed to do just basic everyday things like own food, earn money, or, in some cases it even went so far as to not allow slaves to read. As far as some of the covert ways in which Africans resisted slavery, remember covert means, I guess you could call it kind of sneakily. We looked at some of the ways in which they would sabotage their equipment where they couldn't get as much work done. They would also do things like faking sickness. In other words, just things to kind of slow down the process, to kind of get back at the slave owners and make sure they didn't get done with whatever they were doing as quickly as possible. And also, kind of at the extreme end of it, or however you want to call it, they would escape in some cases as well. So, question 3 under the key concept 2.1 is what factors contributed to the regional differences among the British colonies? Now, you've got that chart, so there's more things on it than that. You need to know all these, but these are kind of the highlights of it. The first one we'll look at are the New England colonies. What were the major characteristics of the New England colonies? And the first thing that needs to hit your head is that they were very religious because they were set up on Puritan values. Talked about Puritanism a little bit. With John Winthrop in the City of the Hill speech when he comes over, or sermon when he comes over, and how that kind of set the tone for Massachusetts Bay and other New England colonies. Also, when we looked at those charts, or the ship manifest, you saw more families come over, which led to a close-knit, homogeneous society based on the family, which is a little bit different than other colonies. And lastly, because of going back to the charts, the geographic aspects of New England, they couldn't rely on agriculture, so they had to have kind of a mixed economy of agriculture and commerce, including shipbuilding and lumber and things like that. Kind of talked about it in the last slide, but the environment as far as affecting the top of the economy, once again, they've got rocky soils, harsh winters. They can't have the steady, consistent type of agriculture that they had in other colonies like the Chesapeake or the Middle. Next, we'll move to the Middle colonies and the characteristics of it. The main word that needs to hit your head when you hear Middle colonies, they were very diverse as far as their economic aspects, their demography, and the religious as well. And when we talk about the Middle colonies, we're talking about particularly Pennsylvania and New York. With their economy, I know some of you hopefully got this burned in your head since you missed it on the quiz, but they were known as the bread colonies because they had an export economy based on cereal crops like wheat and other things. So that leads to their name. And things like that. So no, their economy is based on cereal crops, and just the characteristics of it in general are very diverse. Rolling on down the seaboard to the Chesapeake colonies and their characteristics. Remember the Chesapeake colonies of Virginia and Maryland. The big thing first is agriculture and the tobacco economy that was established there. That was their main form of making money and what really allowed these guys to prosper. We looked at the ship manifest with who came over to Virginia, and you noticed it was predominantly young men who were coming over as indentured servants, particularly at the beginnings of this colony. Now, when you have a plantation economy, the thing that comes about is through the headright system and other things, some people were able to acquire a lot of land, and what this led to was a plantation or planter aristocracy, where you have a few people who own tons of land that kind of run the culture, political, and economic aspects of these colonies. And lastly, know the characteristics of indentured servants and slaves, which we've already looked at. So kind of tying into the last slide, why was the Chesapeake so dependent on imported labor? And look, it all boils down to the fact that they just got too many acres and not enough people. Agriculture is very labor intensive at this time. There's no mechanization. There's none of the things that we take for granted today. I mean, us being a farming community, and think about, me being a farmer. I've got a combine, I've got a disc, I've got a trailer truck. I've got all these things that make this job easier, so it doesn't take many people to plant and harvest a lot of acres. Well, it's not like that back then. You've got to have tons of people to get your crop out, be it tobacco, corn, whatever it is. And they didn't have enough people coming in naturally from England to staff or to work on these plantations, so they had to bring people in. And it starts, once again, as indentured servants and moves over to slavery. Now we move further south with the Carolina colonies, and for the first time we actually get out of what we now know as the United States with the British islands of the West Indies and the Caribbean. So these colonies, as far as their characteristics go, their economies are based on staple crops. They pretty much produce one product for export to America and to England and to other places in the English Empire. And the reason they can do that is because just think about what it's like in the Carolinas. Think about what the climate's like in the Caribbean. It's pretty much nice all year round. So they have a very favorable climate to be able to grow crops, which means they have a long growing season, okay, which is a little bit different than anywhere else, particularly north of here. And also the last characteristic is the use of slave labor for the same characteristics we talked about, or same reasons we talked about with the Chesapeake. As far as the demographics of these colonies and what makes it stand out is the fact that you have huge slave populations compared to British and other European people. So it's a majority slave population in these colonies. So that wraps up Key Concept 2.1, and we wrote a 2.2, which is European colonization efforts in North America stimulated cultural contact and intensified conflict between the colonizers and the American Indians. In other words, how did these guys start coming into contact with each other, and what happened once they did? So the first thing we've got to look at with this in the first question is, how did competition lead to conflict within and between North American colonial possessions and American Indians? In other words, as these European powers start fighting and conflicting a little bit in Europe, these things spread over to the New World, and it impacts the way that France, English, and the Dutch interact with natives? And the answer to it, the first one is conflict spread to North America. I put that on there twice. I have no idea why, but it's too late to change it. So forgive me, and led to interactions between Europeans and natives. And these interactions were as follows. Number one, they would sign alliance treaties with natives to try to get them to help them out a little bit, and to, more importantly, get them to not attack whoever signed the alliance with them. Number two, you've got trade, and that comes more into play with France, but it did happen on a smaller scale with other European powers. And last, they would just flat out arm them. They would give them guns and other weapons to help them fight against other people. And then how did these lead to political instability? I mean, it's pretty self-obvious. You give somebody guns and they're going to attack somebody, it's going to be a little bit more ramped up. It's going to be more violent. It's going to be more intense. And it just leads to an overall sense of instability. Number two, colonies focused on gaining new sources of labor and on producing and acquiring commodities that were valued in Europe. So the question is, why did European nations depend on their colonies for commodities such as fur and tobacco? And it's very simple. You can't make this stuff. You can't produce it in Europe because the climate's not the same as the eastern coast and the southern part of the U.S. The climate, the ground, whatever it is, okay, you just can't produce it. So they've got to rely on these colonies for these raw materials. And also, they're making a huge amount of money off this, so it's a huge source of revenue, particularly due to the popularity of things like smoking and the fashions that come with fur hats and coats and things like that in Europe. So tons of money. You're not able to produce it in Europe, so you use these colonies or you exploit these colonies to get that. Second answer to this question is the goals and interests of European leaders diverged from those of colonial citizens, leading to growing mistrust. And you start to see kind of the beginnings or the seeds being planted for the American Revolution that's going to come in the next period. Now, nothing on the scale of what we're going to talk about in the next period, but you see the beginnings of it. And the first thing we're going to look at that begins to lead the mistrust is the Wool Act. Now, here's the deal on this, guys. England historically has been one of the largest wool producers in the world. And through means and measures that we don't need to go through here, some sheep got smuggled over to the colonies and they began producing their own wool. Well, once they do that, they start selling it to people, and it starts to cut into the pocketbook of the British. So they passed the Wool Act because they're losing money. And it did a couple of things. Number one, it banned the export of wool from the colonies, which means they can't sell the wool that they produce. And number two, they were only allowed to import wool from Britain. So Britain kind of gets to keep their monopoly of the wool trade over the colonies. As far as the colonial reactions to it, they protested it. They got a little rowdy about it, but nothing too big and nothing on the scale of what we're going to see on down the line. Second thing during this period that led to growing mistrust between the colonies and the British is the Molasses Act. Now, here's the deal on this. It's very hard to grow sugar in North America. So a lot of it is grown in the West Indies and the Caribbean, and the colonial people had a pretty good appetite for things like sugar, molasses, and in particular rum. And they were starting to import it from West Indian colonies or Caribbean colonies that were run by the French. And the British didn't like that, once again, because it starts cutting into the pocketbook. So they passed the Molasses Act to put a huge tax on it in the hopes that the colonists would only buy sugar, molasses, and rum from British colonies in the Caribbean. So they're trying to keep them from buying it from the French. Kind of the same thing as far as the colonists reacting to it. It leads to growing mistrust, it leads to protest, and most importantly, it grows to smuggling, which is, sneaking this stuff up from the Caribbean into the colonies. Question 2, under this key concept, how and why did clashes between Europeans and American Indians cause changes in both cultures? So the key word in this question is changes. Number one answer under that, continuing interactions with Europeans increase the flow of trade and diseases into native communities, causing cultural and demographic changes. So you need to pay attention to the cultural aspect of it and the demographic. And as far as an example of the cultural changes that occurred, you begin to see some religious conversion amongst the natives. Not on the mass scale that they wanted, but you do see it come into play a little bit because of contact with Europeans. And the best example that you might see is the Wampanoag tribe in the Northeast. Number two, the demographic changes that occurred. We talked about that with the Columbian Exchange. You know what's going to happen once they come in and introduce disease, and it's going to be drastic population collapse, which happens all over North America at this time. For our purposes, the main one with the British colonies is the Huron Confederacy and the breakup and dispersal or diffusion of them. Next on the list of answers is Spanish colonizers began to shift, and we're shifting over to the Spanish here, began to shift to a policy of accommodation towards American Indians, particularly after the Pueblo Revolt. First thing you need to know about this is what does the word accommodation mean, and it means compromise. In other words, you kind of make it a little bit easier on them and you don't go as hard line when it comes to conversion. As far as how did this contrast with the English policy towards American Indians, the English went about it a little bit different at this time. They set up what were called praying towns, which means that they set up actual towns or places where natives were to be gathered en masse and Christianized. Next is by supplying American Indian allies with alcohol and weapons, Europeans helped increase the intensity and destruction of American Indian warfare. I don't think I need to do a lot of explaining with this because you can figure out what happens once you start supplying people with booze and weapons, how warfare and how aggressive is going to go, or how aggression is going to go. So that was it for Key Concept 2.2, and I'm going to try to get through 2.3 as quickly as possible because it is Saturday morning and it is college football season, and I do live in the South, so I'm ready to settle in and watch these games. So 2.3, the increasing political, economic, and cultural exchanges within the Atlantic world had a profound impact on the development of colonial societies. Key word in this is Atlantic world. That basically means Western Europe, particularly England and the Americas. Okay, so be aware of that if you see a question with regards to that. Obviously, the key word with the key concept is going to be the impact. So what happens to colonial societies as these exchanges continue to develop and intensify? So the first question is, how did the Atlantic world interactions among Europeans, Africans, and American Indians stimulate economic growth, expand social networks, and reshape labor systems? So we're looking at economic growth, we're looking at social networks, and labor systems. Number one, the growth of the Atlantic economy created a shared labor market and exchange of goods. All that means is triangular trade. You've heard that your entire life, so you see from the bottom. It's the trade between Africa with slaves coming over to the New World, the products, raw materials that were sent over to Europe, and the ones that came back with regards to finished products. So it's a trade between North America, Europe, and Africa is all it is. And that also is a part of it playing in is the African slave market, which we've already looked at. The next concept or component is Anglica Zation, is promoted in the British colonies. The first thing you need to know, and it's one of those big AP words, is what does that mean? And all it means simply is the attempt by the British to control the colonies and make them more British. In other words, make them more homogeneous or the same. Next thing you need to know is how was this Anglicization promoted in the colonies? In other words, how is Britain trying to make the colonies a little bit more similar to the British? Number one were the political communities that were set up that were based on British models, similar in setup and philosophy. Two were the commercial ties that we've already talked about as far as the trade between the colonies and the English. Three was the transatlantic print culture, which is in the form of pamphlets and broadsides and things that were printed in England that were distributed in the colonies. And I'll grant you, there's going to be a pretty big amount of lag with the amount of time that it takes for something to get over to the colonies, but they're doing this in an attempt to keep people up to date as much as they can on what's going on in Britain and to try to keep some kind of ties to England, some kind of similar culture. Four is the spread of Enlightenment ideals. We'll talk about the Enlightenment in the next unit. The Enlightenment kind of comes back to bite the British in the tail because once it spreads over in the colonies, it eventually plays a part in the American Revolution. And number four is religious toleration in the form of the Maryland Toleration Act, which was on your last quiz, and you should probably know the components of and what it did. Going on down the line, next is the ideas on race were stimulated by the presence of slavery and the impact of colonial wars, and that goes back to things we've already talked about with the strict racial hierarchy that was present in the British colonies. Alright, wrapping this up in the next couple slides, why and in what ways did colonists who had become accustomed to a large degree of autonomy begin to resist British efforts to strengthen its imperial control? So, going back to it again, you start to see the beginnings of, I guess you could call it discontentment, a little bit getting riled up against the British during this time period that fully blooms during the American Revolution. And the first thing was, the British colonies developed mostly similar patterns of culture, laws, institutions, and governments over time. Now, you don't see what we will eventually call a national identity in the colonies, but there begins to be a lot of coming together when it comes to the philosophies, to the laws, to everything with the colonies. Next is the efforts to integrate the colonies into an imperial structure and the fact that it was met with scant success because of colonial resistance. In other words, Britain's trying to put a little bit of a leash on the colonies at this time because they kind of think colonies are kind of forgetting their place. They keep forgetting that they're a possession of Britain. And the way that the British did this was by setting up what was called the Dominion of New England, which was going to combine the northeastern colonies into one colony. They were going to revoke the charters of the New England colonies and put them strictly under British control. And they did this under a guy named Sir Edmund Andros, who comes in and just goes above and beyond what the colonists were ready for with regards to restrictions and taking away some of their freedoms and things like that. And obviously the colonists don't take too kind of that. We'll talk about in the next period how one of the main things that leads to the American Revolution is the fact that I'll bring it up as the out of sight, out of mind philosophy that the British had towards the colonies. And by the time they realized they needed to control them, it was really too late, because once the colonies got used to running things on their own, they didn't want the British to come in and assert control over them. So they react horribly to this. They end up kicking the governor out and basically telling Britain that this kind of stuff's not going to work. And it plays a pretty big role going down the line. The next one on the list is the Navigation Acts, which is a way for Britain to control trade over the colonies and get rid of some of the smuggling and things. It did not work at all. It leads to a lot of piracy and smuggling and other things that we'll deal with in class. Just kind of know the components of it and the reaction of the colonies. And last but not least, resistance drew on colonial experiences of self-government, evolving ideas of liberty, enlightenment influence, and greater religious independence to form some kind of resistance. In other words, just like I said, they got used to doing things on their own and did not react well once Britain tried to kind of put the clamps down on them. And you know a couple things out of this. The enlightenment influence, like I said, we'll talk about later. And the religious independence, which is going to tie into the Great Awakening, which is what we're talked about in class on Monday, or going to talk about on Monday. So know the components of the Great Awakening, be able to recognize and know the names Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, and kind of just be able to tie it into the fact that it does lead to a greater sense of independence and a furthering away from British control, or a furthering separation between the British. Alright guys, that wraps up period 2. I tried to keep it as short as possible for you. Remember, you got the exam coming up. You have to turn in this study guide with the exam, so get to studying, do what you got to do, and good luck.